Sarah Mitchell stood behind the cracked window of her tiny cabin, watching the people of Dusty Creek walk past on the dirt road. Their laughter echoed through the thin walls, and she knew they were talking about her again. The same cruel jokes, the same pointing fingers, the same whispers that had followed her for 3 long years. She pulled her worn shawl tighter around her shoulders and stepped back from the window. The mirror on the wall showed her reflection, and she understood why they laughed. Her left hand was different from other people's hands. It was smaller, twisted from birth, with fingers that didn't work the same way. The doctors in the big city had told her mother there was nothing they could do. Sarah had learned to live with it, but the people of Dusty Creek never let her forget she was different. The town wasn't big, maybe 200 people on a good day. Everyone knew everyone else's business, and Sarah's business was that she was the strange woman who lived alone on the edge of town. Her parents had died when she was 18, leaving her the small cabin and a few chickens. That was 5 years ago, and she had been fighting to survive ever since. Sarah walked to her kitchen table where she kept her sewing work. Mrs. Henderson from the general store sometimes gave her clothes to fix, but she only paid half of what she would pay anyone else. For charity, Mrs. Henderson always said with a fake smile. Sarah needed the money, so she took the work without complaint. Today there were 3 dresses that needed hemming and a man's shirt with a torn sleeve. Sarah picked up her needle with her good hand and began to work. She had taught herself to sew by holding the fabric steady with her left hand and doing the detailed work with her right. It took longer than it would take someone else, but her stitches were small and neat. She took pride in her work, even if others didn't appreciate it. A knock at the door made her jump. Visitors were rare, and usually they brought bad news. Sarah set down her sewing and walked slowly to the door. Through the small window, she could see a tall man in a cowboy hat standing on her porch. She didn't recognize him, which was unusual in a town this small. Sarah opened the door just a crack and looked out. The man was older than her, maybe 35, with kind brown eyes and a gentle smile. His clothes were clean but worn, the type a working cowboy would wear. His horse was tied to her fence post, a beautiful black mare with white markings. "Good afternoon, miss," the man said, tipping his hat. "I'm sorry to bother you, but I was wondering if you might have some water for my horse and me. We've been riding since dawn, and the well in town seems to be surrounded by quite a crowd." Sarah knew what he meant. The town well was in the center of Dusty Creek, right where everyone gathered to gossip. A stranger asking for water would draw attention and questions. She looked at his horse, who did look tired and thirsty. "There's a pump around back," Sarah said quietly, opening the door a little wider. "Help yourself." "Thank you kindly," the man said. He started to turn away, then stopped. "I'm Jake Carson. I'll be working at the Double Bar Ranch for a while." Sarah nodded but didn't give her name. She watched as he led his horse to the back of her cabin. Through the kitchen window, she could see him pumping water into the metal trough she used for her chickens. He was gentle with his horse, speaking to her in low, calm words. When the horse was drinking, he filled his own water bottle and took a long drink. Jake walked back to the front of the cabin and knocked again. Sarah opened the door, wondering what he wanted now. "I wanted to thank you properly," Jake said. "That's a mighty fine water pump you have there, and I noticed you have some loose boards on your chicken coop. If you'd like, I could fix them for you. No charge, just to repay your kindness." Sarah stared at him. In 3 years of living alone, no one had ever offered to help her with anything without wanting something in return. She was suspicious. "Why would you do that?" she asked. Jake's smile was warm and honest. "Well, miss, I was raised to believe that neighbors should help neighbors, and you helped me when I needed it." Sarah thought about the loose boards on her chicken coop. She had tried to fix them herself, but it was hard to hold the board steady and hammer at the same time with her different hand. 3 of her best hens had escaped last week because the boards had come loose again. "I don't have money to pay you," Sarah said. Didn't ask for money, Jake replied. Just trying to be neighborly. Sarah studied his face. He seemed genuine, but she had learned not to trust easily. Still, she needed those boards fixed, and winter was coming. All right, she said finally. There's a hammer and some nails in the shed behind the house. Jake tipped his hat again. Much obliged. I'll get started right away. Sarah closed the door and went back to her sewing, but she found it hard to concentrate. Through the window, she could hear Jake working on the chicken coop. The steady rhythm of his hammer was somehow comforting. It had been so long since she had heard the sounds of someone working around her home. After an hour, Jake knocked on her door again. Sarah set down her needle and answered. All finished, he said. Those boards won't be coming loose again anytime soon. And I noticed one of your fence posts was starting to lean, so I straightened that up too. Sarah looked past him toward the chicken coop. The loose boards were now securely attached, and the whole structure looked more solid than it had in months. Thank you, she said, and meant it. You're welcome, Jake said. He started to leave, then turned back. I hope you don't mind me saying, but those are some fine chickens you have there. Rhode Island Reds, aren't they? Sarah nodded, surprised. Most people in town didn't know one chicken breed from another. My grandmother raised those same chickens back in Missouri, Jake continued. Best egg layers you can find. She always said they were smart birds, too. Despite herself, Sarah found herself almost smiling. Her chickens were smart, and they did lay good eggs. It was nice to have someone notice. They lay about a dozen eggs a day, Sarah said quietly. That's mighty fine production, Jake said admiringly. I bet those eggs are delicious, nothing like a fresh egg from a happy chicken. Sarah felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Someone was talking to her like she was a normal person, not the strange woman with the different hand. Jake hadn't even seemed to notice her hand, or if he had, he didn't care. I should get going, Jake said. Thank you again for the water. And if you ever need any more help around the place, just let me know. I'll be at the Double Bar Ranch for the next few months. After he left, Sarah went outside to look at the chicken coop. The repair work was excellent, better than anything she could have done herself. The fence post he had mentioned was indeed straight now, and he had even cleaned up the scattered tools in her shed. As she gathered eggs from her chickens, Sarah thought about Jake Carson. He was different from the other men in town. He had looked at her face when he talked, not at her hand. He had been polite and respectful, and he had actually listened when she spoke. Most people in Dusty Creek acted like she was invisible, or worse, like she was some kind of curiosity to stare at. The next morning, Sarah was hanging laundry on the line behind her cabin when she heard horses approaching. She looked toward the road and saw 3 riders coming her way. Her heart sank when she recognized them. It was Tom Bradley and his 2 friends, Pete and Mick. They were the worst of the young men in town, always looking for someone to pick on. Tom was the banker's son, spoiled and mean. He had never worked a day in his life, but he acted like he owned the whole town. Pete and Mick followed him around like lost puppies, laughing at his cruel jokes and joining in his mischief. The 3 men rode into Sarah's yard without being invited. Tom stayed on his horse but leaned forward in his saddle, grinning down at her. Well, well, Tom said loudly. If it isn't our local freak show, how are you doing, Sarah? Still trying to pretend you're a normal person? Sarah's face burned with shame, but she didn't respond. She had learned that fighting back only made things worse. Look at her trying to hang that laundry, Pete said, pointing at Sarah's left hand. How does she even hold the clothespins? The 3 men laughed as if this was the funniest thing they had ever heard. Sarah continued hanging clothes, trying to ignore them, but her hands were shaking. I heard you had a visitor yesterday, Tom continued. Some cowboy stopped by. Did you pay him to pretend to be nice to you? Because I can't imagine why anyone would talk to you otherwise. Maybe she's finally going to find herself a husband. Mick said with a nasty laugh. Though I can't imagine what kind of man would want damaged goods. Sarah dropped the wet shirt she was holding. The cruel words hit her like physical blows. She bent to pick up the shirt, but Tom urged his horse closer. "You know what I think?" Tom said, his voice getting meaner. "I think you're getting ideas above your station. Just because some stranger was polite to you doesn't mean you're suddenly good enough for normal people." "That's right," Pete agreed. "Freaks belong with freaks. You should remember your place." Sarah straightened up, clutching the wet shirt to her chest. Tears were starting to form in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall in front of these men. "Please leave," she said quietly. "Please leave," Tom repeated in a mocking voice. "Did you hear that, boys? She wants us to leave." "What if we don't want to?" The three men looked at each other and grinned. Sarah realized they weren't planning to leave anytime soon. She started walking toward her cabin, hoping to get inside and lock the door, but Tom rode his horse to block her path. "Not so fast," Tom said. "We rode all the way out here to visit with you. It would be rude to run away." Sarah was trapped between the three horses. Her heart was racing, and she was starting to feel real fear. These men had never cornered her like this before. Usually they were content to laugh and make jokes from a distance. "What do you want?" Sarah asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "We want you to understand something," Tom said, his face turning serious. "This is a decent town full of decent people. We don't need someone like you giving visitors the wrong idea about us." "That cowboy you talked to yesterday," Pete added. "He's going to be working around here for a while. We don't want him getting the wrong impression about our town because he met the local freak." Sarah's confusion must have shown on her face because Tom laughed again. "You really are stupid, aren't you?" he said. "You think he was being nice because he likes you? He was probably just feeling sorry for you. Pity, Sarah. That's all it was." The words cut deep because Sarah had wondered the same thing. Was Jake really being kind, or was he just feeling sorry for her? The doubt that had been growing in her mind suddenly seemed much larger. "So here's what's going to happen," Tom continued. "If that cowboy comes around here again, you're going to tell him you're not interested in talking. You're going to send him away. We don't need him thinking our town is full of people like you." "And if you don't," Mick added, "we'll make sure everyone knows what kind of person you really are." Sarah stared at them. "What do you mean?" Tom's smile was cold and cruel. "Well, for example, everyone might hear about how you throw yourself at any man who shows you the slightest attention. How desperate you are for male company. How you probably do anything for a kind word." Sarah's face went white. She understood what he was threatening. In a small town like Dusty Creek, rumors like that could destroy what little reputation she had left. No one would hire her to do sewing work if they thought she was immoral. "That's not true," Sarah whispered. "Truth doesn't matter," Tom said with a shrug. "What matters is what people believe, and people will believe whatever we tell them." The three men sat on their horses, looking down at Sarah with satisfied expressions. They had her trapped, and they knew it. Sarah felt smaller and more alone than she had ever felt in her life. "Do we understand each other?" Tom asked. Sarah nodded, not trusting her voice. "Good," Tom said. "Remember, if that cowboy comes back, you send him away. And if we hear that you've been friendly with any other visitors to our town, you'll be sorry." The three men turned their horses and rode away, laughing and talking among themselves. Sarah stood in her yard, still clutching the wet shirt, and watched them disappear down the road. She went inside her cabin and closed the door, then sat at her kitchen table and put her head in her hands. The tears she had been holding back finally came, and she cried until she had no tears left. Sarah had always known that some people in town didn't like her, but she had never realized how much power they had over her life. Tom Bradley's threats weren't empty. His father was the banker, and the family had influence in Dusty Creek. If Tom spread rumors about her, people would believe him. She thought about Jake Carson and his offer to help if she needed anything. For a brief moment yesterday, she had felt what it might be like to have a friend. Someone who didn't judge her for being different, who treated her with kindness and respect. But now she knew it was impossible. If Jake came back, she would have to send him away. She couldn't risk the rumors and the trouble it would cause. She was trapped in her loneliness and there was no way out. Sarah went back to her sewing, but her hands were shaking so badly she couldn't hold the needle steady. She set the work aside and went to her bedroom, where she lay down and stared at the ceiling. Outside, she could hear her chickens clucking contentedly in their repaired coop. At least someone was happy, she thought bitterly. At least the chickens didn't care that she was different. As the sun began to set, Sarah made herself some soup and tried to eat, but she had no appetite. She kept thinking about Tom's cruel words and his threats. She thought about Jake's kindness and how she would have to throw it away. Most of all, she thought about the unfairness of it all. She had never hurt anyone in Dusty Creek. She kept to herself, worked hard, and tried to be a good neighbor. But because she was born different, because her hand didn't look like everyone else's, she was treated like she didn't deserve basic human kindness. Sarah went to bed early, but sleep wouldn't come. She lay awake thinking about her future, and it looked as empty and lonely as ever. Tomorrow would be the same as today, and the day after would be the same as tomorrow. She would sew clothes for people who looked down on her, sell eggs to people who barely acknowledged her existence, and live alone in her cabin on the edge of town. And if anyone ever showed her kindness again, she would have to turn them away to protect herself from the cruelty of others. The moon rose high and bright outside her window, but Sarah didn't see its beauty. She only saw the long, dark road ahead of her, stretching endlessly into a future filled with loneliness and shame. 3 days passed before Jake Carson returned to Sarah's cabin. 3 days during which Sarah jumped at every sound, wondering if it was him coming back or Tom Bradley and his friends returning with more threats. When she finally saw Jake riding up the path on his black mare, her heart filled with both joy and terror. Sarah watched from her window as Jake dismounted and tied his horse to the fence post. He looked tired, like he had been working hard at the ranch. His clothes were dusty, and there was sweat on his forehead despite the cool autumn air. He walked to her door with the same confident stride she remembered, but this time Sarah's stomach was tied in knots. The knock came gentle but firm. Sarah waited a long moment before answering, trying to find the courage to do what she knew she had to do. "Good afternoon, Miss Sarah," Jake said when she opened the door. His smile was warm and genuine, and it made what she had to do even harder. "Hello?" Sarah said quietly, not opening the door all the way. "I was in town today buying supplies, and Mrs. Henderson mentioned you did sewing work," Jake said. "I've got a jacket that needs mending, and I was hoping you might take a look at it." Sarah's heart sank. Of course Mrs. Henderson had told him about her sewing. The old woman probably thought it was funny, sending the handsome cowboy to the strange woman on the edge of town. "I'm sorry," Sarah said, the words feeling like rocks in her throat. "I'm not taking any new work right now." Jake's eyebrows rose slightly. "Oh, well, that's all right. Maybe when you're less busy?" Sarah forced herself to look directly at him, even though it hurt to see the confusion in his kind eyes. "I don't think that would be a good idea." There was a long silence. Jake studied her face, and Sarah could see him trying to understand what had changed since their last meeting. "Did I do something wrong the other day?" Jake asked quietly. "If I overstepped somehow, I apologize." The genuine concern in his voice almost broke Sarah's resolve. She wanted to tell him the truth, to explain about Tom Bradley and his threats, but she couldn't risk it. "No, you didn't do anything wrong," Sarah said. I prefer to keep to myself." Jake nodded slowly, but he didn't seem convinced. I understand. I don't want to bother you if you'd rather be left alone. He started to turn away, and Sarah felt a moment of panic. Part of her wanted to call him back, to invite him in for coffee, to pretend for just a little while that she was a normal woman who could have normal conversations with a kind man. But Tom's threats echoed in her mind, and she kept silent. Jake stopped and looked back at her. Miss Sarah, if anyone in town has been giving you trouble, I want you to know you can tell me. I may be new here, but I don't like seeing people picked on. Sarah's eyes widened. How could he possibly know? Had someone seen Tom and his friends at her cabin? I don't know what you mean, Sarah said quickly. Jake studied her face again, and Sarah had the uncomfortable feeling that he could see right through her lies. All right, Jake said finally, but the offer stands. If you need help, you just let me know. This time when he turned to leave, Sarah closed the door quickly and leaned against it. Her hands were shaking, and she felt sick to her stomach. Jake was offering her exactly what she needed most: friendship, help, understanding, and she had to turn it away. Sarah went to her window and watched Jake ride away. He looked back once at her cabin before disappearing around the bend in the road. When he was gone, Sarah sat at her kitchen table and cried again. But this time, the tears were for what she was losing, not just for what had already been lost. The next morning, Sarah was feeding her chickens when she heard voices coming from the road. She looked up to see a group of women from town walking past her cabin. They were laughing and talking loudly, and Sarah caught fragments of their conversation. Saw him talking to her again yesterday. Don't know what he sees in someone like that. Probably feels sorry for her. Should warn him about what kind of person she really is. Sarah's face burned with shame. The women were talking about her and Jake, just as Tom had predicted they would. The gossip was already starting, even though she had sent Jake away. One of the women, Mrs. Patterson from the dress shop, looked directly at Sarah and said something to the others that made them all laugh. Sarah couldn't hear the words, but she could guess what they were saying. The same cruel jokes, the same mean-spirited comments she had heard her whole life. Sarah finished feeding her chickens and hurried back inside. She realized that sending Jake away hadn't stopped the gossip at all. The damage was already done. Just by being kind to her, Jake had made her a target for even more cruelty. Later that afternoon, Sarah was working on a dress for Mrs. Henderson when someone knocked on her door. She looked out the window and saw Jake's horse tied to her fence again. Sarah's heart raced. Why had he come back after she had clearly told him to stay away? Sarah opened the door just a crack. Jake was standing on her porch, but this time he wasn't smiling. His face was serious, almost angry. Miss Sarah, Jake said, I need to ask you something, and I hope you'll give me an honest answer. Sarah's mouth went dry. What is it? Has someone in this town threatened you because you talked to me? The question was so direct and unexpected that Sarah couldn't hide her reaction. Her face went white and she took a step backward. I don't know what you mean, Sarah said weakly. I think you do, Jake said gently. I've been asking around town about you and I'm starting to get a picture of what's been going on. Sarah's panic flared. What have people been telling you? Well, Jake said, his voice getting harder, I've heard some interesting stories about how the young men in town like to ride out here and bother you, about how certain families think they can decide who you're allowed to talk to. Sarah stared at him. Someone had told him about Tom Bradley and his friends. But who? And why? I also heard, Jake continued, that you're the finest seamstress in 3 counties, but you only get work from people who want to pay you half what your skills are worth. Sarah was too shocked to speak. No one had ever stood up for her before, certainly not to her face. Now I'm going to ask you again, Jake said, his brown eyes serious and kind. Has someone threatened you because you were kind to me? Sarah looked at Jake's honest face and felt something break inside her chest. She was so tired of being afraid, so tired of being alone, so tired of letting bullies control her life. "Yes," she whispered. Jake nodded grimly. "I thought so. Will you tell me what happened?" Sarah glanced around nervously, as if Tom Bradley might appear at any moment. Could you come inside?" Sarah asked. "I don't want anyone to see us talking." Jake followed her into the small cabin. It was the first time a man had been inside her home since her father died, and Sarah felt nervous and embarrassed about the simple furnishings and worn furniture. "It's a nice place," Jake said, looking around. "Cozy." Sarah sat at her kitchen table and gestured for Jake to sit across from her. Her hands were folded in her lap, and she was staring down at them. "Tom Bradley came here after you left the other day," Sarah began quietly. "He had 2 friends with him. They said if I was friendly to you again, they would spread rumors about me." Jake's jaw tightened. "What kind of rumors?" Sarah's face turned red. "They said they would tell everyone I was immoral, that I threw myself at any man who showed me attention." "That's ridiculous," Jake said angrily. "You're one of the most proper ladies I've ever met." Sarah looked up at him in surprise. "You think I'm proper?" "Of course you are," Jake said. "You're polite, hardworking, and you mind your own business. Those are the marks of a lady in my book." Sarah felt tears starting to form in her eyes. When was the last time someone had said something genuinely nice about her? "Tom also said," Sarah continued, "that people like me don't belong with normal people, that I should remember my place." Jake was quiet for a long moment, and Sarah could see anger building in his face. "Sarah," Jake said finally, "can I ask you something personal?" Sarah nodded nervously. "Your hand," Jake said gently. "Were you born that way?" Sarah's face burned with shame. She had been dreading this moment when Jake would finally notice her deformity and react with disgust or pity. "Yes," Sarah whispered, instinctively trying to hide her left hand under the table. "May I see it?" Jake asked softly. Sarah shook her head quickly. "It's ugly. People don't like to look at it." "I'm not people," Jake said. "I'm your friend, and friends don't judge each other." Slowly, reluctantly, Sarah brought her left hand up and placed it on the table. It was smaller than her right hand, with fingers that were curved and didn't straighten completely. The thumb was positioned differently, and the whole hand had a twisted appearance. Jake looked at her hand for a long moment, then reached across the table and gently touched it with his own hand. "Does it hurt?" he asked. Sarah was so surprised by his gentle touch that she almost couldn't speak. "No, it doesn't work the same way as my other hand." "But you can use it some?" "Yes. I can hold things steady while I work with my other hand. I've learned to manage." Jake nodded thoughtfully. "My cousin back in Texas was born with a clubfoot. Didn't stop him from becoming the best horse trainer in 3 counties. People are more than their physical differences." Sarah stared at him. Not only was Jake not disgusted by her hand, he was treating it like it was just a normal part of who she was. "You really don't mind?" Sarah asked quietly. "Mind what? That you're different?" "Sarah, different doesn't mean lesser. It just means different." Sarah felt like she might cry again, but this time they would be tears of relief and gratitude. "Now," Jake said, his voice becoming firm again, "let's talk about Tom Bradley and his friends. What they're doing to you is wrong, and it needs to stop." Sarah shook her head quickly. "Please don't make trouble. They have power in this town. They can make my life even worse than it already is." "Your life shouldn't have to be bad at all," Jake said. "You're a good person who deserves to be treated with respect." "But I'm different," Sarah said. I don't fit in. So what? Jake said. Half the best people I've known didn't fit in where they were. That doesn't give anyone the right to treat you poorly. Sarah wanted to believe him, but she had lived with cruelty for so long that kindness felt foreign and frightening. What can we do? Sarah asked. Even if you talk to them, they'll just wait until you leave town and then make things worse for me. Jake leaned back in his chair and thought for a moment. Well, the first thing we're going to do is make sure you're not alone when they come around. I'm going to start checking on you regular like. But that will just make them angrier, Sarah protested. Let them be angry, Jake said. Bullies like Tom Bradley count on people being too scared to stand up to them. Once someone calls their bluff, they usually back down pretty quick. Sarah wasn't so sure, but there was something comforting about Jake's confidence. The second thing, Jake continued, is that you're going to stop letting them make you feel ashamed of who you are. You're a fine woman, Sarah Mitchell, and it's time you started believing that. How can I believe that when everyone in town thinks I'm a freak? Sarah asked sadly. Not everyone, Jake said. I've been talking to people, remember? Mrs. Williams at the boarding house told me you once helped her when she was sick, bringing her soup and medicine even though she had never been particularly kind to you. Old Mr. Peterson said you found his lost dog last winter and brought her home safe. And Dr. Martinez told me you're the only person in town who can mend his surgical instruments properly. Sarah was stunned. She had forgotten about those incidents, and she had no idea anyone remembered them, let alone thought well of her for them. There are good people in this town, Jake continued, but they've been letting the bad ones do all the talking. That's going to change. How? Sarah asked. Jake's smile was determined and a little dangerous. Well, I reckon it's time this town learned what real character looks like, and you're going to help me show them. Sarah felt a flutter of hope in her chest, but it was mixed with fear. What do you mean? I mean, Jake said, standing up from the table, that you and I are going to walk into town tomorrow morning, and you're going to hold your head high while I introduce you to some people as my friend. Sarah's eyes widened in terror. Jake, I can't. People will stare and whisper. Tom and his friends will be furious. Let them be furious, Jake said calmly, and let people stare. Once they see that a decent man treats you with respect, some of them might start questioning their own behavior. Sarah shook her head rapidly. It won't work. It will just make everything worse. Jake sat back down and took both of Sarah's hands in his own, careful to be gentle with her left hand. Sarah, he said quietly, you've been hiding in this cabin for years, hoping that if you stay quiet and small enough, people will leave you alone. Has it worked? Sarah thought about Tom's recent visit and shook her head. That's because bullies don't leave people alone just because they're quiet, Jake said. They keep pushing until someone pushes back. But I'm not strong enough to push back, Sarah said desperately. You don't have to be strong by yourself, Jake said. That's what friends are for. Sarah looked into Jake's honest brown eyes and saw something she had never seen before directed at her. Genuine caring. Not pity, not charity, but real concern for her well-being. Why are you doing this? Sarah asked. Why do you care what happens to me? Jake was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke, his voice was soft and sincere. Because you remind me of my sister, he said finally. Sarah's eyebrows rose. Your sister? My little sister Emma was born with a withered arm, Jake explained. Back home in Texas, some people treated her the same way people here treat you. It broke my heart to watch her try to make herself invisible just to avoid their cruelty. What happened to her? Sarah asked. Jake's smile was proud and sad at the same time. She met a man who saw past her arm to the incredible woman she was. They're married now, with 2 beautiful children. But it took her years to believe she deserved happiness, and I always regretted not standing up for her more when we were young. Sarah understood now. Jake wasn't helping her out of pity or charity. He was helping her because he had seen how cruelty could damage someone he loved, and he didn't want to see it happen again. "I'm not asking you to trust me completely right away," Jake said. "I know that's too much after all you've been through, but I am asking you to trust me enough to try. One step at a time." Sarah looked down at their joined hands. Jake's hands were calloused from hard work, but gentle in their touch. He was offering her something she had given up hope of ever having, someone who would stand beside her instead of behind her or in front of her. "What if it doesn't work?" Sarah asked quietly. "Then at least you'll know you tried," Jake said. "And I'll still be your friend either way." Sarah took a deep breath. Every instinct told her to stay safe, to stay hidden, to send Jake away before he could get hurt by association with her. But a small, brave part of her heart was tired of being afraid. "All right," Sarah said finally. "I'll try." Jake's smile was brilliant. "That's all anyone can ask for. Now let's start planning how we're going to show this town what Sarah Mitchell is really made of." As the evening light faded outside her windows, Sarah sat with Jake and made plans that would have seemed impossible just hours before. For the first time in years, she was looking forward to tomorrow instead of dreading it. The fear was still there, coiled in her stomach like a snake, but it was joined now by something she had almost forgotten: hope. Sarah woke before dawn the next morning, her stomach churning with anxiety. Today was the day she and Jake would walk into Dusty Creek together, and she was already regretting her decision to trust him. What if he had changed his mind overnight? What if this was all some elaborate joke? What if Tom Bradley and his friends were waiting for them? She dressed carefully in her best dress, a blue cotton one she had made herself 2 years ago. It was simple but well made, and the color brought out her eyes. Sarah braided her long brown hair and pinned it up neatly, then looked at herself in the mirror. She looked like a respectable woman, she thought, if people could just see past her hand. Jake arrived at 9 o'clock, just as he had promised. He was riding his black mare and leading a gentle brown gelding. "Good morning, Sarah," Jake said, dismounting with his usual easy grace. "Beautiful day for a ride into town." Sarah looked at the extra horse nervously. "I don't ride very well," she said, "and with my hand—" "This is Butterscotch," Jake said, patting the brown horse's neck. "He's the calmest horse at the Double Bar Ranch. He practically rides himself, and I'll be right beside you the whole way." Sarah approached the horse cautiously. Butterscotch was indeed calm, standing perfectly still as she examined him. "Here," Jake said, moving to help her mount. "Put your good hand on the saddle horn and your foot in the stirrup. I'll give you a boost." With Jake's help, Sarah managed to get into the saddle. The horse didn't move an inch during the process, and once she was seated, she found the motion of his walking to be soothing. "See," Jake said, mounting his own horse. "Natural rider." As they rode toward town, Jake kept up a steady stream of conversation about the weather, the countryside, and the horses. Sarah realized he was trying to keep her mind off what they were about to do, and she was grateful for his thoughtfulness. "Remember," Jake said, as the first buildings of Dusty Creek came into view, "you have nothing to be ashamed of. Hold your head up and let people see the fine woman you are." Sarah's heart was beating so fast she thought it might burst, but she nodded and tried to sit straighter in her saddle. Their first stop was the general store. Mrs. Henderson's store was always busy on Saturday mornings, and today was no exception. Sarah could see several people through the windows, and her courage almost failed her completely. "I can't do this," Sarah whispered, as they tied their horses to the hitching post. "Yes, you can," Jake said firmly. "I'll be right beside you, and we're just going to buy some supplies. Nothing more." Jake offered Sarah his arm as they walked up the steps to the store. The gesture was old-fashioned and courteous, and Sarah felt a little steadier with his support. The bell above the door chimed as they entered, and every conversation in the store stopped. Sarah could feel eyes boring into her from every direction, and she had to resist the urge to turn and run. "Good morning, Mrs. Henderson," Jake said pleasantly, as if he didn't notice the stares and whispers. Mrs. Henderson looked back and forth between Jake and Sarah with barely concealed shock. "Mr. Carson," she said stiffly, "what can I do for you?" "Miss Mitchell and I need some supplies," Jake said, emphasizing Sarah's name so everyone in the store would hear it. "She mentioned she was low on flour, and I need some coffee and tobacco." Sarah was amazed at how normal Jake made it sound, as if it was perfectly ordinary for them to be shopping together. Mrs. Henderson gathered the supplies with obvious reluctance, glancing repeatedly at Sarah as if she couldn't believe what she was seeing. "That'll be $2.50, Mrs. Henderson said. Jake paid for the supplies and handed some of them to Sarah. "Thank you kindly, Mrs. Henderson. Miss Mitchell, shall we visit the post office next?" As they left the store, Sarah could hear the explosion of whispers behind them. Every person in the store would be talking about what they had just seen, and the news would spread through town within the hour. That wasn't so bad, Jake said quietly as they walked down the main street. Sarah wasn't so sure. She could feel eyes watching them from every window and doorway. People were stopping their conversations to stare. And she heard her name whispered more than once. At the post office, old Mr. Jameson was so surprised to see Sarah that he forgot to be unpleasant. He simply stared as Jake collected his mail and asked about sending a letter to Texas. "Miss Mitchell?" Mr. Jameson said suddenly, as if he had just remembered something. "I've been meaning to ask you, would you be willing to mend a quilt for my wife? It's an old one, very delicate, and she's been worried about trusting it to just anyone." Sarah's eyes widened in surprise. Mr. Jameson had never spoken directly to her before, and he was asking for her help with something important to his family. Yes, I could look at it," Sarah said quietly. "Wonderful," Mr. Jameson said with a smile. "I'll bring it by your place tomorrow afternoon." As they left the post office, Jake squeezed Sarah's arm gently. "See," he said, "people are already starting to see you differently." Their next stop was the bank, and Sarah's anxiety spiked again. This was Tom Bradley's father's domain, and she was sure they would encounter trouble here. The bank was quiet when they entered, with only one customer ahead of them in line. Sarah recognized him as Dr. Martinez, the town doctor. When he saw her, he smiled warmly. "Miss Mitchell," Dr. Martinez said, approaching them. "How nice to see you in town. I've been meaning to stop by your place. I have some medical instruments that need repair, and you're the only person I trust with such delicate work." Sarah was stunned. Like Mr. Jameson, Dr. Martinez was treating her with genuine respect and friendliness. "I would be happy to help," Sarah managed to say. "Excellent. I'll bring them by early next week." Dr. Martinez tipped his hat to Jake. "Mr. Carson, isn't it? I heard you've been staying at the Double Bar. Fine ranch." "Yes, sir," Jake replied. "Miss Mitchell has been kind enough to show me around the area a bit." Dr. Martinez nodded approvingly. "You couldn't ask for a better guide. Miss Mitchell knows more about the local wildlife and plants than anyone in the county. Very observant young lady." After Dr. Martinez left, Sarah and Jake conducted their business at the bank without incident. Tom's father was polite but cool, clearly uncomfortable with Sarah's presence, but unwilling to be openly rude in front of Jake. As they walked back toward their horses, Sarah began to feel something she hadn't experienced in years, a sense of belonging. The stares and whispers were still there, but they were mixed now with nods of acknowledgement and even a few genuine smiles. "I can't believe Dr. Martinez spoke to me like that," Sarah said quietly. "And Mr. Jameson asking for my help with his wife's quilt." "Like I told you," Jake said, "there are good people in this town. They just needed someone to remind them how to act properly." They were untying their horses when trouble finally found them. Tom Bradley and his two friends came riding down the main street at a fast pace, their horses' hooves raising clouds of dust. They pulled up short when they saw Jake and Sarah. "Well, well," Tom said loudly, his voice carrying to everyone on the street. "Look who's playing dress-up and pretending to be normal people." Sarah's face went white, but Jake simply turned to face Tom with a calm expression. "Afternoon?" "Tom," Jake said pleasantly. "Nice day for a ride." Tom's face was red with anger. He clearly hadn't expected Jake to be so composed. "What do you think you're doing, Carson?" Tom demanded. "Parading around town with her like she's some kind of respectable woman." A crowd was beginning to gather. Sarah could see people coming out of shops and offices to see what the commotion was about. Her worst fears were coming true. "I'm not sure what you mean," Jake said, his voice still calm but with an edge of steel underneath. "Miss Mitchell is a respectable woman, one of the finest ladies I've had the pleasure to know." Tom laughed harshly. "Lady? You must be joking. Everyone knows what she is. A freak who lives alone on the edge of town because she doesn't belong with normal people." Sarah flinched as if she had been struck. But Jake moved to stand slightly in front of her. "I think you might want to reconsider those words," Jake said quietly, but his voice carried clearly to the watching crowd. "Why?" Tom sneered. "Are you going to make me? You and the cripple?" The word cripple hung in the air like a slap. Sarah had been called that word many times before, but never in front of so many people. She wanted to disappear into the ground. Jake's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his posture. He was still calm, but there was something dangerous about his stillness. "Tom," Jake said conversationally, "I've been hearing some interesting things about you since I came to town." Tom's confident expression faltered slightly. "What things?" "Well," Jake said, loud enough for the growing crowd to hear, "I heard about how you like to ride out to Miss Mitchell's place with your friends here and threaten a woman who lives alone. That's not the behavior of a gentleman." Tom's face turned even redder. "That's none of your business." "I also heard," Jake continued, "about the time you got so drunk at the saloon that you fell off your horse and had to walk home in your underwear because you lost your pants somewhere." Several people in the crowd snickered, and Tom's friends looked embarrassed. This was clearly a story Tom didn't want repeated. "And I heard about the money that went missing from your father's bank last year," Jake said, his voice still conversational but carrying clearly to everyone present. "The money that mysteriously reappeared after you took that sudden trip to Denver." Tom went very still. "You don't know what you're talking about." "Don't I?" Jake asked mildly. "Funny thing about small towns, people talk, and when you've been acting like the town bully for years, people remember things about you. Things they might not have mentioned before because they were afraid of your family's influence." The crowd was listening intently now, and Sarah could see that the story about the missing money was news to most of them. Tom's father was the respected banker, but if his son was a thief... "Now," Jake continued, "here's what's going to happen. You and your friends are going to apologize to Miss Mitchell for the way you've treated her, and then you're going to leave her alone from now on." Tom's laugh was shaky. "Like hell I will." "Oh, I think you will," Jake said calmly. "Because if you don't, I'm going to have a long conversation with Sheriff Morrison about some of the things I've been hearing, and I don't think your father would appreciate having his bank investigated for missing funds." Tom looked around at the watching crowd and seemed to realize for the first time that he had lost control of the situation. The people who had always deferred to him because of his family's status were looking at him with suspicion and disgust. "You can't prove anything," Tom said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Maybe not," Jake agreed. "But I don't have to prove anything to start people asking questions. And once people start asking questions about you, Tom, I suspect they'll find some very interesting answers." Tom looked at his friends for support, but Pete and Mick were edging their horses away from him. They clearly didn't want to be associated with whatever trouble Tom had gotten himself into. "This isn't over," Tom said weakly. "Yes, it is," Jake said firmly. "It's over because you're going to make sure it's over, starting with that apology." Tom looked around the crowd again and realized he had no choice. His reputation in town was hanging by a thread, and everyone was watching to see what he would do. I apologize," Tom mumbled, not looking at Sarah. "Louder," Jake said. "And look at her when you say it. Miss Mitchell deserves that much respect." Tom raised his eyes reluctantly to Sarah's face. "I apologize for bothering you," he said more clearly. Sarah nodded stiffly, not trusting her voice. "Good," Jake said. "Now ride away. And remember what we talked about." Tom jerked his horse's reins and rode off down the street, his friends following behind him. The crowd began to disperse, people talking excitedly among themselves about what they had just witnessed. Dr. Martinez approached them, his face serious. "Mr. Carson, if what you said about Tom Bradley and the bank money is true, the sheriff needs to know." "I'll be speaking with Sheriff Morrison tomorrow," Jake assured him. After the crowd had completely dispersed, Sarah and Jake mounted their horses and rode slowly out of town. Sarah was quiet, trying to process everything that had happened. "Are you all right?" Jake asked when they were clear of the buildings. "I think so," Sarah said slowly. "I can't believe you stood up to Tom like that." "Someone needed to," Jake said. "Bullies like Tom count on people being too afraid or too polite to call them out. Once someone does, they usually fold pretty quick." "But what if he retaliates? What if he tries to hurt you?" Jake's smile was grim. "Tom Bradley isn't going to hurt anyone. After today, he'll be too busy trying to stay out of jail." They rode in comfortable silence for a while, enjoying the peaceful countryside after the tension in town. "Jake," Sarah said finally, "why did you really come to Dusty Creek? I know you said you were working at the Double Bar, but—" Jake was quiet for a moment. "You're right. I had another reason for coming here." Sarah's heart sank. She had known it was too good to be true. "I'm a Texas Ranger," Jake said quietly. "I've been tracking a man who's been stealing from small-town banks across 3 states. The trail led here to Dusty Creek." Sarah stared at him. "You think Tom Bradley is the thief?" "I'm almost certain of it," Jake said. "The pattern fits, and the timing of his trips out of town matches the robberies in other places. But I needed time to gather evidence before I could make an arrest." Sarah felt confused and a little hurt. "So everything you've done for me, it was just because you needed to blend in while you were investigating?" Jake stopped his horse abruptly and turned to face her. "Sarah, look at me." Sarah reluctantly met his eyes. "Everything I told you about my sister was true," Jake said earnestly. "And everything I said about you being a fine woman was true too. Yes, I came here on business, but what happened between us, that's real. That has nothing to do with my job." Sarah searched his face and saw only honesty there. "I was going to tell you the truth tonight," Jake continued. "I didn't want there to be any lies between us." "What happens now?" Sarah asked. "When you arrest Tom, will you leave town?" "That depends," Jake said carefully. "On what?" Jake took a deep breath. "On whether you'd like me to stay. I'm thinking about resigning from the Rangers and settling down somewhere. Maybe opening a ranch of my own." Sarah's heart began to beat faster. "Why would you want to stay here?" "Because," Jake said simply, "this is where you are." Sarah stared at him, hardly daring to believe what she was hearing. "I know it's fast," Jake said quickly. "And I know you've been hurt a lot. I'm not asking for an answer right now. I just want you to know that what I feel for you is real, and it has nothing to do with pity or charity." "What do you feel for me?" Sarah asked quietly. Jake's smile was tender. "I think I'm falling in love with you, Sarah Mitchell. You're brave and kind and strong, and you see the world in a way that makes me want to be a better man." Sarah felt tears starting to form in her eyes, but this time they were tears of joy. "I think I might be falling in love with you too," she whispered. Jake's smile was radiant. He reached over and took her hand, the twisted one, and brought it to his lips to kiss it gently. "Then I guess I'll be staying in Dusty Creek," he said. 6 months later, Sarah stood in front of the mirror in her cabin, wearing a white dress she had made herself. It was her wedding dress, and in an hour, she would marry Jake Carson in the little church in town. The woman in the mirror looked different from the frightened, ashamed woman who had hidden in this cabin for so many years. This woman's eyes were bright with happiness, her face glowed with health and confidence, and she held her head high with pride. After Tom Bradley's arrest and trial, everything in Dusty Creek had changed for Sarah. The people who had ignored or mocked her began to see her as Jake saw her, a skilled, intelligent, kind woman who deserved respect. Her sewing business had grown so much that she was booked solid for 3 months in advance. She had even hired Mrs. Patterson's daughter to help with the simpler jobs. More importantly, Sarah had learned to see herself differently. She no longer hid her left hand or apologized for being different. She had discovered that her worth as a person had nothing to do with the shape of her fingers. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Sarah opened it to find Dr. Martinez's wife holding a beautiful bouquet of wildflowers. "From all the ladies in town," Mrs. Martinez said with a warm smile, "we wanted you to know how happy we are for you." Sarah accepted the flowers with tears in her eyes. The same women who had gossiped about her and treated her with suspicion were now celebrating her happiness. "Thank you," Sarah said. "Thank you so much." An hour later, Sarah walked down the aisle of the church on Dr. Martinez's arm. The church was packed with people from town, and they were all smiling at her with genuine warmth and affection. At the altar, Jake waited in his best suit, his face glowing with love and pride. As they exchanged vows, Sarah thought about how much her life had changed. She was no longer the woman the town pointed and laughed at. She was Sarah Carson now, a respected member of the community, a successful businesswoman, and most importantly, a woman who knew her own worth. After the ceremony, as she and Jake walked out of the church together, Sarah saw some of the children from town throwing flower petals in their path and cheering. She remembered how those same children used to run away from her in fear, and she marveled at the transformation. "Happy?" Jake asked, squeezing her hand. "Happier than I ever thought possible," Sarah replied. Jake lifted her hand to his lips and kissed it gently, just as he had that first day when he told her he loved her. It was the same hand the town had once pointed at and mocked, but Jake's touch had always made it feel beautiful and whole. As they rode away from the church toward their new home on the ranch Jake had bought just outside town, Sarah reflected on the truth she had learned. Sometimes all it takes is one person's kindness to change everything. One person who sees your worth when others see only your differences. One person willing to take your hand and stand beside you until the rest of the world learns to see you as you really are. The town that had once pointed and laughed now waved and cheered as the newlyweds rode toward their future together. And Sarah Carson, née Mitchell, held her head high and waved back, her twisted hand proudly displayed for all to see. No longer a source of shame, but a symbol of the strength and courage it had taken to overcome the cruelty of others and find love in the most unexpected place. Behind them, the church bells rang out across the prairie, announcing to the world that love had triumphed over prejudice. Kindness had conquered cruelty, and that sometimes the most beautiful love stories begin with someone brave enough to take an outcast's hand and refuse to let go.